Hey everybody, this is Ben Kesnoka, co-founder and partner at Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is our podcast, where we go deep on all things business and technology with world-leading experts.
Hello, everybody. I'm Olga Sergeyevich, the head of investor relations at Village Global. Excited to introduce our guests today, Gurdain Bhutani and Zishan Mohammadi. They both are network investors with Village Global and co-founders and general partners at MBX. MBX is an early-stage VC that invests in public health. And prior to that, they co-founded another healthcare and life sciences venture capital firm, FundRx. They both have a wealth of investing and operating experience across biotech, medical devices, healthcare IT, and services. And in today's conversation, we'll dive into the evolution of investing models in healthcare, opportunities in public health specifically, and technology-led paradigm shifts in medicine today, and how they impact our lives. Gurdain, Zishan, welcome to Village Global Stories.
Thanks so much for having us on.
So you've had a lot of experience investing in biotech, healthcare IT services, and other areas. Tell us a little bit about how you view the healthcare sector today, how it's evolved over the last decade, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities investing in this area?
Absolutely. So, I think what's interesting about this space is that there's been some real paradigm shifts over the last decade in terms of where pharmas in particular have seen sort of the biggest growth opportunities. So we're recording this podcast on August 10th. Yesterday, Eli Lilly crossed $500 billion in market cap, became the most valuable pharma in the world. And they did that by pursuing a strategy that most other pharmas thought didn't make sense. Most pharmas over the last decade have focused on niche indications, rare diseases, these pseudo arbitrage opportunities where they can develop a drug for a relatively small number of people, charge super high prices for that therapy, and as a result, add dollars to their market cap. Lilly, on the other hand, pursued a strategy of therapeutics that they felt could have population level health benefit. And so they developed this drug, which is a GLP-1 agonist that they've seen a lot of promise for in obesity, but yesterday they revealed data that showed it seems to have quite a large benefit in heart disease and stroke, which are some of the biggest killers in our society. And as a result of that, in a single day, they added $75 billion of market cap on the heels of just one data announcement. And so I think there's this shift that's emerging now where pharmas and biotechs are realizing that, hey, maybe the strategy of yesteryear, where we focus on these narrow disease states, maybe doesn't make sense, and we should actually pursue these population level opportunities because when they work, they can be phenomenal economic outcomes, but also deliver huge value to society. So that's kind of what we're seeing in the life sciences land. On the other side of the coin, I think what we've learned over the last decade is that there's been a huge emergence of venture-backed healthcare services companies, right? So-called tech-enabled services companies. And I think what we've seen in that universe, with some exceptions, is that fundamentally, the venture returns may not be there. There's a handful of strategic acquisitions and IPOs. We'll see how those shake out over time. But it turns out that healthcare services is a relatively low margin business. Even if you add tech, maybe you're achieving 30 or 40% gross margins. It's a radical departure from traditional technology investing and SaaS margins. And so for conventionally structured venture rounds, I think our view is that in that world, probably the outcomes may be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, but maybe not in the tens of billions of dollars that we're seeing in conventional tech. And so I think that's also driving a paradigm shift where entrepreneurs have figured that out, funds have figured that out, and there's a shift now in what kinds of businesses are really venture backable versus not.
And how would all that impact sort of us as consumers of healthcare services, right? Because if, let's say, pharma companies only start to focus on, the diseases that have the highest impact on population level, et cetera, and then there are certain areas where we're saying, well, it's not interesting to back that, then do we expect there will be other types of players with perhaps, not necessarily venture return profile who would come in and back it? Or sort of how do you think about private sector investing in the sector in the larger public health policy context?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the biotech side of things, I think what this may mean is that we see perhaps a relative decrease in the number of relatively narrow disease programs that are funded. I think time will tell. There still remain a large number of incentives there, but my hope is that maybe those programs will continue to get funded, but that we'll also see increased funding for these population level health threats. In the healthcare services universe, I think the challenge there is that there may be fewer tech-enabled healthcare services companies formed over the coming years, and the types of firms that back them may look very different than conventional venture firms. There are now firms out there that have PE-esque operator DNA that are integrating technology in a really powerful way into healthcare delivery to create, companies that I think will be able to deliver a higher quality of care, do it in a more accessible way, make that experience of care better, but that recognize that they need very high ownership in order to rationalize those investments. And so, will your generalist seed fund continue to back, tech-enabled healthcare services? My guess is probably not. But will there be an emergence of a large number of these operator-led funds that take more of a hands-on incubation style approach? I think so.
Got it. That makes sense. And I think, one thing that's interesting about the world of technology and different types of businesses is almost like an Animal Planet, right? Where you sort of have different adaptations, right? And when you think about the risk return profile of different types of investment, they just move on from, venture backable universe to perhaps a little bit different models in private capital. So let's talk a little bit about healthcare. Obviously, to be able to invest in that sector requires a lot of specialized knowledge. And both of you raised multiple funds and strategies. And of course, both of you worked hard to compete for the hearts and minds of the best founders in the sector. So what are some of the things that you find are really important to be a great investor in healthcare overall, which perhaps you don't necessarily hear LPs ask about, or what would you advise LPs to pay attention to?
Well, I think LPs should just pay attention to DPI. I think that's the only thing that matters. In all seriousness, I think beyond that, I think for LPs who want sector specific exposure, like in healthcare, they should consider breaking down that sector into what's obvious and not obvious to really find that alpha. So first, when we talk about obvious, we think they will get exposure to obvious spaces in healthcare like virtual care delivery, remote patient monitoring, general behavioral health, et cetera, through generalist funds. And to be honest, I don't think that's an alpha generating strategy if you want to be sector specific. But second, when we talk about non-obvious in healthcare, by that, what we mean is that what is truly pre-obvious, because we want these areas to become obvious to capital downstream from us, such as investing at the intersection of environmental health and human health. For that, I would then focus on managers who are demonstrating the ability to invest in these spaces before generalist funds catch up to really capture that alpha. So for example, in 2017, 2018, before the healthcare staffing labor issues were sort of in vogue, we spent a lot of time with administrators to understand that their needs were not really related to better travel nursing platforms. It was actually, how do we better utilize our existing workforce? And that led to our early investment in a company called CareRev in 2019, which is one of the leading labor marketplaces and workforce management platforms in the space. So whether it's with us or any other manager, the way you ought to select managers is by them demonstrating they're actually doing the work, building the information advantages, the networks in these spaces, and then showing their ability to find these companies before the larger funds provide growth capital. And I think for entrepreneurs, you kind of want to be thinking about this space as, am I addressing a root cause problem? Am I developing something net new? Right, versus an incremental, innovation or product, right, that might unfortunately sort of get lost in the sea of solutions out there.
Thank you for that perfect segue into my next question. Let's dig deeper into public health specifically. So how do you think about that sector in the context of the broader healthcare investing space? And give us a Venn diagram if there is anything else that goes into it, and what's important to identify those opportunities and be able to find the best companies.
I really appreciate you, Olga, describing public health as a sector. We're trying to make it one that's viable for private market investment. But historically, public health really has been the domain of the academy and of governments, right? When you think about public health, you think about the CDC, you think about schools of public health. Rarely do people think about entrepreneurship within public health. We believe, on the other hand, that actually innovation is incredibly important in this domain. And the reason that we believe that is because what we're observing is a broad trend in society where there's very few of us that have access to truly clean water, safety from climate change, safe air, safety from air pollution, access to food that's clean and good for you, quiet spaces, and so forth. And these are all fundamentally public health issues. These are issues that you really can't address particularly well in the doctor's office, right? If someone's exposed to a lot of air pollution, yes, they might develop asthma and you can treat the asthma, but you're not really solving the root cause problem there, right? And so when people think about these issues, let's take noise pollution, for example. Noise pollution is actually a very significant public health threat. 1 out of 20, if not, 1/10 of heart attacks in America are actually driven in large part by noise pollution. When you think about that, you say, okay, well, public health researchers can identify noise is bad for us, and government should go and regulate noise. But that actually doesn't fully solve the problem, because yes, a government can say, yes, we need to regulate noise in this way or that way, but we need innovators and we need entrepreneurs to actually figure out how to make society less noisy by leveraging technology. So as an example of this, there are innovators that are developing quiet concrete, right? Literally making our roads quieter so that when vehicles drive over them, we actually are exposed to less noise. There's companies developing noise abatement technology for industrial applications, right? So when people go to work in a mine or on a construction site or wherever else it may be, that's actually a safer and better work environment. And those are fundamentally technology solutions that entrepreneurs are best suited to develop. And so I think what's emerging within public health is, there's an increasing willingness for these public-private partnerships for the opportunity to engage innovators. And we think that these issues will be, fundamentally critical to address to preserve sort of the fabric of our society over the coming decades. And so that's why we're so excited about public health as a sector.
And when I hear something like, usually or historically, it's been the domain of academia or public sector, my first thought is, well, there's probably a good reason for it. So can you make money investing in the sector?
Yeah. So I would say the internet was once the domain of the public sector. And that led to probably the greatest economic boon of the century, right? As a result of the translation of the internet from what was once fundamentally a government construct into one that private innovators could innovate on top of, right? So I think there's sort of this necessary collaboration that has to occur. I think in terms of venture returns within public health, I think we have a few examples of, yes, you can absolutely make money here, right? If you look at the market caps of Pfizer and Moderna and what they've done in the vaccine space, without question, those are huge economic results. But even more broadly than that, I think there's a fundamental question that LPs need to ask themselves, entrepreneurs need to ask themselves, and us as managers need to ask themselves, which is that, do we believe that these issues will become economically important to society over the coming decades? If you believe that's true, and that people will demand that they have access to clean air, clean water, a better environment, food that's higher quality, et cetera, then absolutely there's going to be huge economic potential. If you don't believe that, that's fair. You may have your reasons for that. We're on one side of the coin. There are people that are on the other. I think time will tell, but we're really excited about the potential here.
Yeah, and I think there's no doubt that there's a lot of value that would come from addressing some of these problems. I think the question is, can you actually capture that value as an entrepreneur building in the sector?
Yep.
And, undoubtedly, a lot of the entrepreneurs in this sector specifically are very much driven by their passion for solving these problems, right? And by impact they can have. So what would be your advice to entrepreneurs looking to address different problems in the sector from the perspective of what type of funding should they seek, right? Because it seems that there's probably a lot of different players with different expectations for both, the level of return and the timeline and the volatility and certainty of it. So as a founder, what's the sort of founder capital source fit framework that you would recommend?
Yeah. So I think this comes down to whether the first two sort of things I just spoke about, the academy and government, have gotten to a place where it's now possible for private innovators to take advantage of what's already happened in a field and capture economic value as a result of that. So let's take Tesla as an example. The big driver of Tesla's growth, right, is tax subsidies and rebates for purchasing, electric vehicles, right? In the absence of that, or in the absence of, the development of, Li batteries and a number of other pieces of the tech in the academy that are used in those cars, there's no Tesla, or at least Tesla doesn't capture the economic value that it has today. I think the same is true within this field. So as an entrepreneur, if I'm thinking about starting a company, what I would think about is, okay, is the basic research at a place where that can now be translated into commercial applications? Have governments caught up in terms of the regulatory environment, the tax environment, whatever it is from an incentive standpoint, where it now makes sense? There's now an unlock that's occurred for us to capture economic value. And then am I the right person to build that? If all those things are true, I think you can raise venture capital. I think if those things are true, you can produce venture returns. If only one of those things are true, right? Like maybe the basic science is there, but the government hasn't caught up. It's tough. You might end up in a place where you're trying to do something thinking that, the government might add some regulations that would benefit our company or something, and that never comes to pass and you don't produce a venture return. So you're probably in the vein of, at that point, raising money from NIH or other governmental sources until the market's ready for you. And so the framing of that, I think, is, think about the baseline conditions that are required for, you to succeed as an entrepreneur, and that should inform the funding source that you pursue.
And earlier in this conversation, Zishan mentioned information advantage and the importance of having one to find non-obvious areas to invest. So let's dig deeper into that. One way to think to build an information advantage and a consistent way of having it is a network-based approach. And this is, of course, something that we're very focused on at Village Global. You're focused on with MBX. And many funds launched, some form of scout programs in the last decade or so. And on the surface, all of these programs look similar. But as we all know, it's all about the nuance of execution. You had a lot of experience building out these programs and it's core to what you do at MBX. So let's talk a little bit about, your version of, and I think you call it community-driven investment infrastructure. So what does it look like? How you build it? What were some of the challenges? What you've learned about how to, build a program that's sustainable and that is a competitive advantage for you as a fund.
Yep, absolutely. What we did is give people like physicians and scientists in healthcare an opportunity to engage in the innovation cycle where they were historically left out. And it couldn't be more personal to me. My dad is a physician; he's a nephrologist who would take these expert network calls, where he's explaining to investors how dialysis works and what what the population they're treating is like. Have these discussions while dropping us to school. It was sort of funny. It was kind of how we paid for family vacations. But what I remember is wondering and asking, why aren't you getting more than just some cash for providing such valuable insights? So when you zoom out, you realize that you have all of this rich, experienced intellectual and human capital sitting on the sidelines in healthcare. That's already somewhat organized through medical societies, et cetera. But it could be productively applied to the innovation engine. So we built a research and investment framework leveraging a network of 800 leaders in healthcare who help us think through clinical, regulatory, technical, commercial aspects of a company or a space. And we work with them on these specific thesis areas, often co-created with them, which makes it easier for them to share companies and thoughts and effectively work with us on sourcing. But most importantly, we economically incentivize them by sharing our carried interest and offering real cash incentives to truly show reciprocity. And most importantly, we respect their time. These are really busy people, so when you engage them, you want to kind of come to them having done the work and not just necessarily looking to pull information out of them. But what we learned about this is that we can really unpack and kind of get into the weeds of highly complex areas of healthcare, finding root causes of these big problems that we can ultimately invest in, and then effectively support founders with this same network. which ends up being a virtuous cycle of research and sourcing and portfolio acceleration, et cetera. I think where people kind of lose a little bit of vision around, what they call sort of the platform teams and so forth, is sort of artificially engaging these groups, over productizing, trying to make it, almost feel inauthentic, right, around ways of working with them. And I think that leads to sort of adverse selection, right, across the types of people that want to work with you, the type of information they're going to share, et cetera. So for us, it's been a journey of over 4 or 5 years of really dialing into what works with this group of people and how they want to work with us.
So that's a very interesting idea that the design of this program would select for what type of a person wants to work with you. So how would you describe the perfect archetype of an expert in this field who's the right one for you?
There's no perfect archetype, right? I think we have to think about it in the context of what we're trying to engage around and what this person is trying to get out of it from us, right? We want to make sure it's sort of bi-directional. There are folks that are sort of later in their career who are well established, who have amassed, a wealth of information and experience, who are, self-selecting in that they're excited to be involved in the next thing, right? Excited in the innovation, excited in sort of addressing the problems that they've seen over their career be completely neglected. So they sort of present themselves and are very active and excited to work with us. Similarly, in areas, where we're doing research or expanding in thesis areas, oftentimes it might be a PhD student, right? Very early in their career, very hungry to kind of, get into to get into the startup world or into the commercial world. And they may not have the same real world experience at that point. However, they sort of have this thirst for knowledge and engaging around, going down a rabbit hole with us in a particular space and sharing information and co-creating around a thesis area. And that's sort of a phenotypically a different kind of person than the first kind of person I mentioned. But ultimately, I think for us, it's about being open-minded and sort of welcoming to all folks in who have an interest in addressing some of these public health areas and then working with them and meeting them kind of where they are. So not to be overly picky, I guess, is one critical lesson.
We had a conversation earlier that one of the biggest advantages of young people starting companies is that they just don't know how hard it might be, right? They just don't know what can go wrong. And I'd imagine that in your sector, it's a key advantage for someone to actually not know how hard the US sort of medical, healthcare system infrastructure and navigating it is to even be able to take on the problem, right? And imagine a solution. So I'm glad that you are putting people in business and sort of, giving the tools to invest and build solutions for people who are able to identify them.
Yeah. And you have to sort of be discerning in all of this, right? Our job, Gurdani and I, a lot of what we do is obviously spend time with folks in these networks, but it's also kind of distilling the right information from the feedback, right, in the engagement. And then sort of painting a picture around, a specific thesis area or as it might relate to a company in diligence. And that itself is also, I think, an art, right? So having a great network is one component of it. But I think you have to get a lot of cycles in on how to work with everybody, how to piece the information together, how to really make that actionable. So I would say, building the network is certainly a big, cold start challenge. But then how to effectively leverage it and use it in a way that is productive is, I think, the other half.
Yeah, I think maybe just to add to that a little bit, I think one other lesson for us is just identifying how to engage in productive disagreement really effectively. I'm remembering an investment, we made, many years ago now. I won't mention the company, but we, as part of our diligence, spoke to two individuals that had both previously run health plans. And they had completely opposite feedback on the specific company. We actually loved that because it sort of gave us, I think, both sides of the coin. And for every company, there's always two sides to it, why it might work and why it might not. But, one of those individuals, we then had to go back to and said, hey, we love you, respect you, but we're making this investment, right? Even though you think this company doesn't make sense. And I think learning how to engage in that disagreement in an effective way that demonstrates respect for that person's time and their expertise, but also acknowledges that, they might be wrong, is sort of an art that we've had to learn over the years.
So this actually brings me to another interesting topic, in partnerships where you have two people starting something, right? Obviously, decision making and everything tends to be 50-50, and people sometimes engage in disagreements, etc. And I think there was this long discussion today on Twitter about founder breakups and what a big risk to business that is. So, what are some of your secrets? Just and you two have known each other for a long time, but what were some of the things that you learned in making sure that your partnership is extremely effective and it continues to work?
That's such a good question. So Z and I have worked together now for almost a decade. Certainly known each other for longer than that. And I think one of the things as 50-50 partners, we've tried to integrate into our decision-making process is identifying the strength of our disagreement when there is one. So there are often situations where we might disagree on a potential investment. It might be a deal that I want to do that Z doesn't, and vice versa. But I think what we've realized is that unanimous consent isn't always the best thing, but it's important to understand how strongly the other person disagrees with an opportunity, right? So I think of a specific case where there was a company that Z really was pushing for that I was really on the fence about. And the strength of Zishan's enthusiasm outweighed the strength of my disagreement. And so we decided as a team, let's do it. And fortunately, that investment has worked out fabulously, right? So it's, there's some hindsight bias here. But I think really honing in on that magnitude of belief has been really vital to a strong partnership.
I would add one thing that I really appreciate about our partnership is sort of the candor and self-awareness that we both sort of bring to the table. And it's not a kind of I'm right or wrong, and this is radical transparency type of framework. I mean, which is important. I think giving correct feedback is helpful. But I think I think we're both very self-aware of our strengths and weaknesses. And when we're thinking about building a firm, right, outside of an investment, right, building a firm, taking on some strategic objectives, et cetera, we trust each other based off of that strength of that self-awareness. So where I might have an intuition to go in a certain direction, Gurdain has an intuition to direction. If it's tracking to what we know about ourselves to really be true and be well, right, we're very encouraging of that. And I think that's given us a really strong foundation to continue to build the business of MBX as well.
That's a really interesting insight on sort of thinking about the nuance of the disagreement, right, and the strength of it, and sort of where it comes from, and identifying the ability to find a solution. And I also like that Gurdain gives in situations where enthusiasm is high, as you can imagine. That's something that often.
No, I mean, he's
personality. It gives us all extroverts hope.
You can't have the skeptics win all the time.
That's true, especially in this sector. Well, great. Let's move to the broader topics around healthcare and healthcare investing. What are some of let's think about the last 10 years. What were some of the areas in healthcare which were either enabled by technology, identified by technology, that have sort of become the most important investable opportunities, and which ones of them you think are underhyped, overhyped?
So I'll maybe answer the last question first. Maybe a controversial answer, but I think if you look at the last 30 or 40 years of medicine, the probably biggest fundamental change has been that genomics has taken off. We've been able to figure out how to understand what DNA is, sequence it, use those insights to develop new medicines, understand basic biology, and so on. But I would contend that genomics has failed to live up to the promise. If you look back, you read articles from 15, 20 years ago talking about the genomics revolution, particularly if you read articles from 1998 or 1999, and you hear how people are talking about what will happen in the aughts on the heels of this genomic revolution, a lot of that hasn't come to pass. And I think our contention is that the reason that's the case is not because genomics is unimportant. It's an incredible field. It's the technologies underlying it are hugely valuable, but because we're missing half of the equation. So there's a classic saying in environmental health, which is that your genes load the gun and environment pulls the trigger. And we're missing this equation of understanding our exposures, our environmental exposures, and what's happening outside of us that are dramatically influencing our health. So I'd say while genomics is overhyped, the most underhyped area within healthcare is environmental health and exposure science. And the reason for this is, if you look at disease pathogenesis today, the vast majority of diseases that we suffer from are actually predominantly driven by the environment. If you look at the medicines that we've created, leveraging the most recent advances in gene editing and so forth, unfortunately, those medicines are super expensive and they benefit very few people. I'm optimistic that that won't be the case in a couple of decades. But I think in order to really develop new medicines, new therapies, new care models, and prevent disease from happening in the first place, we really have to pay more attention to environmental health. I see a ton of opportunity there over the coming years.
So give us more examples. And is that something that, let's say this is an issue that's very acute if you live in New York or something, but, the moment you move to Montana, everything is fine. Yeah. Or what are we talking about here? What are some of the examples?
So let's get really specific. So autism incidence has been increasing over the last few decades. There's a lot of arguments in the media about this, but if you look at the scientific literature, definitively autism incidence is increasing. Why is that? So it turns out that leveraging insights from exposomics, which is a field that studies, the exposures that we have over our lifetimes, we've been able to identify that one of the root cause drivers of autism is actually heavy metal exposure during pregnancy. So what we've had to understand in order to unlock this insight is, what are the exposures that someone is experiencing while they're in utero? And how do those in utero exposures and the timing of those exposures, like when in utero they were exposed to this metal or that metal and so forth, ultimately has an effect downstream on childhood development and overall health. And so with that information, what can you do? Well, you can develop diagnostic tools for a disease state for which today there's no great diagnostic. You can develop new medicines that actually treat the underlying mechanism, right, that's driving the cognitive developmental delays. And then you can also engage in better prevention efforts where you can, for instance, during pregnancy, prescribe chelating agents, right? These are basically medicines that capture heavy metals that may be, in your body, to avoid that from happening and the child being exposed, to those contaminants in the first place. And these are for people that, live in both, some of the cleanest cities in the world. This is happening in Stockholm, Sweden, and it's also happening in Flint, Michigan, right, where you have really poor water quality. We're all exposed to this stuff in different amounts, but you need those insights to really understand what's going on and what's driving that disease state.
And let's dig in more into some of the themes around, because this, I presume, is one of your areas of focus within public health. So what are some of the other things that you find exciting today in your investable opportunity set?
Yeah, so I think there's a handful of areas that are exciting to us as a result of recent policy changes, right? So going back to this framework of, you need the basic science, you need sort of the regulatory environment to be right, and then you can unlock innovation. I think one area that's been really exciting to us is, last year there was an act passed by Congress called the FDA Modernization Act, which basically enables the FDA to begin accepting data from in vitro models in lieu of taking data from animal models. So if you talk to any drug developer or any toxicologist or anyone that's in the business developing, pesticides or other chemicals, the way that we test those chemicals for safety historically has been through the paradigm of animal testing. You test something in a rat, then you decide, is this safe or not, or maybe a larger mammal from time to time. So the FDA Modernization Act now, for the first time, is enabling FDA to really accept these data in lieu of classic animal experiments. At the same time, the EPA, which regulates things like pesticides and so forth, has basically committed that by 2035, they will no longer accept data from any mammalian animal tests. So there's this huge regulatory tailwind that's now unlocking a wave of innovation in how we do drug safety testing and chemical product safety testing. And as a result of that, we're seeing really compelling opportunities, for instance, in the organoid on a chip world or the organ chip world, where we can test a huge volume of chemicals or a huge number of different drug candidates on these high throughput systems in essentially mini human livers or mini human hearts that give us much higher fidelity data than we would get from conventional animal testing. So that's one area I think that's really exciting. I'm sure Zishan has a few more.
Yeah, so we like to think about addressing root causes of a lot of these public health challenges, sort of as Gurdain was just walking us through. I think diving into the future of brain science, sort of beyond the level one thinking that we have today in behavioral health, which is, treat people with SSRIs. I think really going deep on understanding how we humans sort of experience this world, right? Like how does the brain work beyond sort of examining neurodegenerative diseases? I think that will be a big space in public health as well. So much of living a happy, healthy life is tied to this. So we're interested in research tools, software, hardware that help us sort of unpack the mind a little bit. I have a mentor who we work with on this space who kind of asks these questions like, could you explain your human experience? And if you think about that question, it's actually really hard to answer, but it opens you up to, wow, we really need to figure this out because so much of sort of the suffering around us, right, is really sort of generated from within in some capacity. Fun fact is we're part of a consortium called BrainMind, which Reid Hoffman is also part of as well, which is obviously one of Village's main luminaries. Separately, I think the intersection of defense and bio is very exciting. We used to call it public health infrastructure. So we previously invested in companies that were detecting pathogens and working on disease surveillance through air filtration. But that was before COVID. But I think through COVID, we've all realized that we're sort of equally at risk of any biological threats, which are either natural or man-made. And it's forcing us to become a much more resilient, independent country. And I think, we need to go beyond, how quickly can we make vaccines? There's implications of this in sort of cyber, in supply chain manufacturing, right? Distributed manufacturing is area we're really interested in. And I think a lot of these areas will create a number of dual use technologies. So I see value in two areas. First, sort of the intersection between the man-made world and the human experience. Clearly, we have a lot of opportunities to invest in solutions to the problems that we've created in that sense. And I think those problems are becoming more obvious, but still very exciting given the infancies of those spaces. Second, the idea of human resiliency. I don't think any of us would say that we have seen the last biological threat in our lifetime. And so supporting and investing in those areas where we can be building platforms for creating that human resiliency in face of these unknown threats is a huge opportunity in terms of where we would like to deploy capital.
So I'm glad you brought this up. So what do you think will kill us all first, artificial intelligence or synthetic biology? I
got to say, I have a friend who talks about this, which is funny. It's like you don't think very highly of humans, right? If you think we can't really figure this one out. I'm in the camp that if there was something, though, I would say probably a biological pathogen first, maybe designed by a computer. Who knows?
Yeah, I would say that's right. In fact, there's if you want to do a really scary Google search at some point, there's been a few case reports of basically cyber attacks that are targeting biomanufacturing facilities. So you basically inject a virus, onto a biomanufacturing facility's system. That virus then instructs the system to produce DNA that is potentially dangerous and could potentially infect sort of like drug pipelines and so forth. So that's like actually happened. So that there are cases of that. So I'd say it's probably a combination of the two.
Well, so I certainly am a techno-optimist. So I did ask this question partially as a joke, but but I would assume both of you are also techno-optimists. And as you think about all these opportunities, chances are there is a lot more potential for whatever novel technologies are being developed, in these areas. There is a lot more potential for them to improve the way we live our lives.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the other side of that coin is that, just in the same way in cybersecurity, you got to do penetration testing and understand what the problems are. Like once we understand that, hey, this is happening, like we can actually build solutions to prevent that from happening, right? So I think being transparent about what the risks are enables us to build the safest, most effective solutions so that we can then spend all of our time focused on all the opportunity that lies in front of us. I think in both AI and SynBio, the opportunities there far exceed the risk, but we've got to pay attention to those risks and protect ourselves from them so that we can actually seize that opportunity in the long run.
Agreed. And one other aspect of your sector that's very interesting and quite unique is that with with a number of areas within it, you sort of have other considerations, right? So for example, ethical considerations or sort of issues around should something be governed or made available to everybody in the world versus specific countries, etc.
Yep.
So what are some of the sort of themes and ways to think about some of these developments where maybe you think differently from the rest of your peer set around either ethics or even just general frameworks of sort of how to guardrail the development and commercialization of some of the technologies you invest in?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly policy guardrails that will be important, right? I think controlling, for instance, certainly there's some synthetic biology technology that we probably want to keep out of the hands of non-state actors and perhaps some state actors, that we will need, both policy solutions to, as well as very clear internal, company policies around. I think at the same time, there's sort of a layer of, sort of the openness of information also unlocks more opportunity and makes us safer, right? So in the open source community, right, a big driver of the argument is that if you're not sharing your code base, well, we can't really test it and understand sort of what the underlying issues may be, how it might be used maliciously, how to make it safer, protect it, and so forth, right? So I think there's some merit to that argument. I think drawing that bright line, though, that's a really hard question, right? And I think that's going to be a debate that we're having as a society over the next few years around what do we really want to make open and what do we not.
And what would be one sort of policy change or or another development that you think would unlock so much more building and talent and capital in the space of public health today?
So similar to kind of what we were talking about earlier, where the government support can really kind of drive a lot of advancements. The government really. The government recently launched ARPA-H, which is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, which is sort of like a DARPA for healthcare. And in my opinion, might be one of the most important pieces of global policy and initiatives for healthcare, especially for the public health space. So if you recall, DARPA was founded back in the late 50s and kind of got us into the space race. It's what got us Sputnik. That ultimately unlocked significant resources to innovate, giving us, GPS, weather satellites, stealth technology, just sort of a massive catalyst for growth in sort of technology and for us as a country sort of to lead globally. But fundamentally, it created a new ecosystem. So my big push is, that we support ARPA-H, that ARPA-H does for healthcare exactly what DARPA did for defense, and I think it'll unlock capital that isn't tied to specific kind of VC funds or anything like that, but really is unlocking that early exciting translational work that we need, so that investors can see technologies that are a little bit further de-risked, and ultimately support them. So I think kind of separating itself from what the NIH does and supporting basic research, ARPA-H will really help get companies off the ground and kind of focus on that applied version of their technologies. And so today they have about $1.5 billion in funding. I think I think they need 10x that, right? I think they should get 15 billion in funding every year and focus on a number of these different challenges that we've talked about. And I think really a lot of the sort of the accelerant to the innovation that we could see in the space is going to come from that program. So I'm very excited about it and a big proponent of it.
And sometimes you hear people say things like FDA is too conservative and, they don't approve a lot of stuff. We should abolish FDA period because sure, they protect us from something that maybe, is not going to work as expected. But the flip side of that is opportunity cost of, all sorts of novel things that could be unleashed on the market and solving a lot of health issues. So what would you say to that point of view, and sort of how do you view U.S. regulators on the spectrum of conservative, liberal, kind of effective versus some of the other perhaps country regulators?
So I'd say the two big ones to compare, right, would be the FDA and the European Medicines Agency, and I think FDA, they're both conservative and liberal in their own ways, right? They have different areas where they're more lenient versus not, and so forth. I think overall, if you talk to drug developers generally, like FDA is quite a collaborative organization, and I think our view of FDA is actually a very positive one, right? I think, on the one hand, yes, it does mean that the pace of innovation perhaps is a bit slower because you have to work through a rigorous process. But I believe that the scientific rigor that's demanded by FDA is actually really important to ensuring that what gets to market is safe. And there's a number of programs now that they've created that for therapies that are in areas where, for instance, there's no other drug available, or there's a population that really needs something quickly. They actually can be quite flexible, right? So they're open to approving things that may be somewhat experimental, but that need to get to market in order for us to understand more. I think the recent approval of aducanumab, which is a Alzheimer's drug, is a great example of this. I mean, that drug, we'll see how much benefit there is. The FDA basically determined, look, this is safe enough to go out and try, and there seems to be some signal of efficacy. But I think we'll need another 10 years to really know how great of a drug that is versus not. And FDA has been really collaborative and willing to make an approval like that. So I think overall, our view is actually probably quite positive from a regulatory standpoint.
Thank you for that. I think it's important to bring counter narratives into some of these conversations, and obviously you're quite close to a lot of these areas. So it's good to give credit where credit is due. And so we're regulated investment advisors, so I can't give financial advice, but there's nothing about medical advice. So let me ask you, in terms of like the recent medical advancements, there's I think a lot of people pay a lot of attention now to all sorts of new things that they can measure about themselves and quantify, and things they track. So out of all that medical content out there, what's like one or two things that you do think are important for people to be aware of? And also, what medical advice do you ignore?
It's a great question. This actually dovetails with your question on FDA to some extent. So, I think there's a large portion of our community, right? Sort of the entrepreneurial community, the VC community, et cetera, that's focused on optimization of health. That's great. We should all strive to be healthier and so forth. It does get to a point where we get into these debates around, like, do I take metformin? Do I microdose this or that? Do I take rapamycin to maybe extend my life and use this drug off-label or that one off-label? And those are really complicated questions, right? It's sort of like there's a handful of pundits that will walk through, you should take this one, don't take this one, that sort of stuff. I think that the challenge is, when most people think about those questions, is they look at it as, this is probably going to help me, or it might help me, and there don't seem to be very many downsides. So why not? Like, why not take X medicine off-label, or do this or do that? And I think the challenge is, when you just look at the clinical data, the downsides tend to not reveal themselves until much later on. And the reason for this is that clinical studies are powered to identify a benefit, right? We statistically design studies in a way so that they're structured to identify, okay, we think, X portion of the study population is going to get this benefit. We're going to enroll this number of people. We're going to capture that benefit. Okay, they saw a reduction in their cognitive decline by this percent or that percent. Studies are not powered to identify rare long tail side effects, which in the aggregate may take a very long time to reveal, but are damning. So a great example of this is, you go way back to the 1960s, there was a drug called phentermine that was available on the market. And by 1996, it was one of the most popular drugs in America. Phentermine, and a close cousin of it, had 18 million prescriptions in 1996. And it was a drug for weight loss. And patients were getting a lot of benefit. It does actually seem to provide real benefit from a weight loss standpoint. And overall, the clinical data on the drug looked pretty good. But it turns out, once it was in real world use at scale, people started to notice that patients on that drug were developing pulmonary hypertension and heart disease at much higher rates than people that weren't on the drug. And so in 1997, a year after its peak sales, it was pulled from the market. And so this is an example of, I think, of a time where both, the drug was sort of approved when FDA was in its infancy. Late stage FDA recognized, hey, maybe we should pull this one. I think it's not providing the risk benefit doesn't make sense. And an example of a time where on the surface, it looked really good and like there weren't many health effects. But once you build up enough data and real world evidence, you identify that, hey, actually, this isn't maybe as safe as we thought it was. So I think the question everyone has to ask themselves is, as the benefit from a drug increases, I think the tolerability for risk, should go up, right? So think of a COVID vaccine, like, yeah, it's a new vaccine. Should I take it? Should I not? I think like the benefit of not getting COVID, not getting long COVID, not exacerbating a pandemic means like, yeah, take the vaccine. But if the benefit's small, right? Like maybe you might extend your life by 2 months or 3 months or have a slightly lower biomarker. Like that's a real question to think about. Like, do the benefits really outweigh the risks? Do we really understand the risks? So I think I wouldn't say I have medical advice in any specific one, but it's more of a philosophical question, or I think we should all ask ourselves when we think about these optimizations.
And Zishan, do you take your vitamins daily? Do you believe in vitamins? What's the latest in vitamins, by the way? It seems like there's always a lot of the innovation around like how efficient they are or the types, etc. So what's your take on that space?
I'm a fan. I take supplements. I think the way to think about supplements is that the supplements one person needs differs from person to person based on their unique biology, diets, habits, etc. So I'm a big fan of Thesis, which is one of our portfolio companies, which takes into account through their personalization algorithm all these factors and sort of helps people match to the right supplements that can support their cognitive performance, brain health, etc. So I think ultimately, depending on the type of what you're trying to get out of it, right, they can be really helpful. Big fan of taking magnesium too.
Well, let's wrap on a lighter note. So tell us, what are some of the things besides public health and investing that you know a lot about?
Yes, I know a little bit about the music industry and the live event space. My senior year of college, I opened a music venue outside nearby Emory, and so booked a lot of acts, booked a lot of nationally recognized folks like Outkast and B.O.B., Mac Miller back then, and some folks on the EDM side, Porter Robinson, etc. So I know a lot about putting a good boogie together. I know that process intimately well.
Well, that's awesome. Maybe we'll engage you next time we put together a founder retreat or something.
I love that.
We should definitely do that. I think it'd be really fun.
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights on everything from healthcare to vitamins to music venues. Really enjoy the conversation and look forward to many more.
Thanks so much for having us on. We love being part of the Village community.
Thanks so much for listening to the Village Global podcast. You can check us out online at villageglobal.vc. We'd love to hear from you, your feedback, your ideas, your inspirations. You can email us at hello@villageglobal.vc.